All right, our next application tonight is for the Waughtown Freedmen School. Spencer McCall is the applicant, and I know, there you are. All right, Mr.
Hello,
McCall, you ready?
Can you hear me?
Yes, you ready?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear
Great.
you.
Thank you all so much. So, of course, I'm from Waughtown. My mother's from Waughtown, actually. And we're going to discuss the Waughtown Freedmen School. Next, please. Well, this is a neat quote about, of course, how we have to go beyond ourselves to find our history by my mentor. Mentor, he doesn't know it, but of course, Mr. Richard Franklin. Next slide, please. Freedmen schools, beyond just being a place of learning, I wasn't even aware of this. There were, of course, black code laws in the state that if a person of color was not working somewhere after slavery, they could be forced back into involuntary servitude. And this even included kids. So beyond just having their kids have to go to learn, there was also a push for these schools because if their kids were on the street loitering or in the fields loitering, they could be forced back into involuntary servitude. So there's a major push behind these schools beyond just learning. Next, please. The Freedmen, of course, in Waughtown and Salem and all over, beyond freedom, began to organize churches and schools. Next, please. Here's a timeline of course, the Freedmen schools in Forsyth County that we know about. There were 4 or 5. There was one in Waughtown that began in 1866, the one in Salem Happy Hill, 1867, the one in Louisville, and the one in Clemensville. So we know of 4 schools in Forsyth County. There are also schools in Davidson County and in Gifford County around us. Next, please. A neat fact to find out, what we're going to find out, was that even though our first teacher of the school was a white individual from Kernersville, that there were also later at this school black teachers. And this is, of course, referenced in a book, actually an essay by a thesis paper that you can find below. It's on the slide sheet. Hostility and Hope, it's called, where she discusses the black teachers that served in our Freedmen schools, which is phenomenal. I mean, it's hard to even imagine that. Next, please. So I'd heard from being in Waughtown and Bellevue my entire life, always there, that there was a Freedmen school there. And so I began to research to find out if it really was true. And I did find records, of course, that it was true, and there was a Freedmen school there in both the Freedmen's Bureau records, in news articles, etc. Of also in oral history. But I did find concrete history, again, in news articles and also in the Freedmen's Bureau records. This is a neat article from Raleigh, which referenced the school in Waughtown. And the writer says, the freedmen of this village, meaning Waughtown, deserve praise for their efforts in raising and supporting a school. It is, as I believe, the first and only Freedmen school in Forsyth. They organized a school for themselves and is taught by W.G. Kilkerner. This article was published in January of 1867. And of course, William Kerner is the grandson of the founder of Kernersville, Joseph Kerner. He also supported blacks having the right to vote, etc. Next slide, please. We do know that they did apply to societies for help to fund their school that was not provided. So these folks in Waughtown paid for this school themselves, which is, again, hard to imagine at that time. They were just a year beyond freedom, and they had a priority on their kids being safe and also having a future, that they found the means to build that. Most of the people that were in Waughtown at this time had ties to Salem. Many were Frees, or the names that you mentioned by Mrs. Hartley earlier. Those folks were all in Waughtown at that time also, having worked in Salem or moved from Salem, etc. So this, of course, is a record from the Freedmen's Bureau that shows a report that was made in December of 1866. And it discusses the schools, the Freedmen schools in the state at that time. A school in Oxford, a school, with a P, I don't know what that says, Raleigh, Salisbury, one plantation called Smith Plantation, Snow Hill, Thomasville, Warrington, Waughtown, and Wellington. A neat thing was the one in Waughtown, as did many schools, had both a traditional school, day school, and also a night school. And we see that there are more kids enrolled in the night school than the day school. Having done research on these schools, early schools, it is obvious that sometimes there are also adults who were in these schools. And of course, the adults were working, so they would go to school at night, or older kids who couldn't afford to, whose parents had to have them working during the daytime. So these schools oftentimes had schools on Sundays and also at night, which was a great benefit to the community. Next, please. The report in January of the next year, of course, does list a school in Salem. They began that, which is in Waughtown. And it goes into detail about how many people were there, et cetera. Neat report in January of the next year. Next slide, please. There was a neat, of course, we know about the school in Salem and Happy Hill. There's a picture there, and of course, a meeting, some of their minutes from a meeting they had in November. November 6th. And what was amazing was, of course, they first met in Salem in August of that year, but on the same day in November, they gave a report. There was also a meeting at the school in Louisville. Next slide, please. Of course, there's a meeting on November 6th, the same day as the second meeting for the one in Salem, with the folks in Louisville who met at the house, of course, of the Louisville founder's house. It's kind of amazing to realize they actually met at his house to discuss their school in Louisville. Next slide, please. The school in Waughtown, we also know from other sources and many sources, was used beyond just the school as a school, but also for churches and even meetings, such as a convention. So it's amazing to realize, of course, this was a real community center in the area. And so because they owned it themselves, they were allowed to host or kind of, decide who could be there. And so people that couldn't meet for conventions and other places at that time could meet here. And there are numerous occasions of Freedmen and Waughtown meeting there. Next slide, please. So where was this school exactly located? We do know that there was a center in Waughtown, Black history and things happening around Waughtown Street and 109 down the Commonsville Road. And so it wasn't surprising to find out that we looked at deeds of folks who lived in that area, who mostly were Frees families, that the school was located there. So in pulling a record from 1877 of an estate file of a former Frees, Harris Frees, his wife Paulina was still living and she kind of executed the estate. It does reference the school, the old church and school. And of course, we know where she lived, how we got where she lived. A neat fact about Harris and Paulina Frees is the Methodist, according to Adelaide Frees, his book about the county history, Lee Frees, who was one of her servants, mentioned how he was born, of course, in Waughtown. And after freedom, the Methodist Blacks began to meet in the cabin of Harris and Paulina Frees. And of course, their neighbors were John and Mary Leinbach Frees, and that's where the people who began people who were Baptist. And he does discuss how they would go from one to the other and how they also would use a schoolhouse for their services after a while. Kind of a neat fact about that. Next slide, please. So this is where the area, of course, is, that area, if you know that area. If you know where Kermit's is, and if you know where the food line in Waughtown is, that's where all this was going on at that time after freedom. Next slide, please. So again, there's an 1870 snapshot, 1880. You'll see Harris and Paulina living there. You also will notice that John, if you didn't know, that John and Mary Leinbach Frees. So again, a very common, very well-known couple in history of Waughtown and this county. John Frees, he died. His wife, Mary Leinbach Frees, married Charles Mars. And of course, his daughter was Eddie Mars. And so Mary raised Eddie Mars. In 1880, you will see another fun name here to our county history, living right in that same spot, the Reverend George W. Howard. And of course, we're from the history of First Baptist Church, that they started out with all the members, and their first members were all living in this little enclave. The Leinbachs, the Freeses, the Hineses / Wrights, the Yoakleys, all those folks who they named in their history of their church were living right in this little enclave. And so when Reverend Holland came from Danville, Virginia in the 1870s to start First Baptist, to organize these folks into a church, he was living right there in that same area. So there's a lot that went on in that little area. Next slide, please. Who would have gone there? And again, we were told that people that went there very prominent. We know who would have gone there, would have been. Next slide, please. Isabella or Belle Butler White, whose father was pretty prominent in the area. He made wagons, was one of the few, if only Black wagon maker we know of in the country at that time. He lived in Waughtown. And she became a principal in Charlotte and she kind of brought the Black schools of Charlotte into the modern era, and a school was named in her honor. And she went to that school also. Next, please. Of course, we know Addie Mars. Everyone knows Addie, who was, of course, the founder of the Addie Mars School in Winston, the Colored Orphanage in Waughtown, Bellevue, and also who was a missionary to Africa and abroad. And she sent many students to Shaw University at that time frame also. Next, please. And of course, the illustrious Dr. Schober, who was also another Waughtown native and the first doctor in the state, who's a Black doctor. Next, please. Thank you very much for your time and consideration for this